welcome to another episode of the Swarm Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This overview of the Haskalah was supposed to function as a kind of first episode, if you will, of a series on the Haskalah. And while this particular series is not currently in the works anymore, a new plan for a series and more episodes on the Haskalah and figures of the Haskalah, some of the Maskilim and their time period and their works, if you will. So for those interested in that, please do let me know, and as well as if you're interested in sponsoring episodes of that in that series, you can message me on WhatsApp or email me svarmchatter@gmail.com. Also, I want to mention with this episode, there'll be a couple of different books and svarim as we mentioned throughout the episode. I'll link to in the show notes. I also do want to mention Professor Litvak has a book that's coming out in a few months, which is an annotated English translation of Moshe Leib Lilium Bloom's Chatas Neurim. So it's called Errors of Youth and Way of Return, 2 novels, and it'll be published by Stanford. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes where you can purchase that, as well as, again, a number of other works that were mentioned in the episode. Sponsor an episode or to support the podcast in any way, you can email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com, or you can find the link and information in the show notes. Additionally, you can find the link to the Svarm Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new books, new Svarm, book tales, and so on. Also to the Svarm Chatter status where I do a similar thing just on a status. And finally, if you can please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Olga Litvak, who is the Roth Professor of Modern European Jewish History at Cornell University. And we'll be discussing the Haskalah, a historical overview of the Haskalah, if you will. And we'll see how much we get to. Obviously, the Haskalah, there's a lot more than that can fit into one episode. Professor Litvak's written a number of books, including Haskalah, the Romantic Movement in Judaism, published by Rutgers University Press. And we'll get to what that means, the Romantic movement, and we'll see how much we cover here. But first, let's get to the basic history of Haskalah. And thank you, Professor Litvak, for joining me.
My pleasure.
Let's start off. Tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, how far back do you want me to go? So I am. I got my degree. I was educated at Columbia University, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, and I got my BA there in history. And I stayed after Columbia College to do a PhD with Michael Stanislavski, who, again, a name I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, and Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who was my teacher both in undergraduate and graduate school. And then I worked at various institutions, and I finally landed at Cornell 6 years ago. Very happy. I feel like I'm finally at the right place. I'm a New Yorker. I don't know what else you want me to say. I guess this is, everybody asks me because my first name and my last name. I am a Litvak by birth and by temperament. My father's family came from Lita to Odessa, and then my parents emigrated to America in 1980. I was 10 years old, and I was plunged right into the American Jewish educational system. I spent many happy years at the Yeshiva of Flatbush, and then a year at Bravenders, which is now called Midreshet Lindenbaum. So I have the right yichus for the Haskalah.
As I was going to say, you have that Litvish background. We'll see how much of the Lithuanian Haskalah we get to.
Yes.
And so you have, there's a lot there. Okay, so, you mentioned your Litvish background, but how did you get interested in Haskalah, the Haskalah period, Maskilim? And we're going to define for listeners, by the way, what that is. There's a lot to clean up and to clarify what we mean by that, but yeah.
The short story is that when I started grad school, Michael Stanislavski, who was my teacher, had us all the first years in the seminar, and everybody was required to work on a single text. And the text course he taught that semester was the Berlin Haskalah. So everybody in the class was required to work on a single piece of material. And I wanted to work on something in Hebrew rather than in German. I didn't want to work on Mendelssohn, so I ended up with Divrei Shalom Ve'emet, and which was my kind of entry point into this field. And I read a lot about him. I mean, I had to do a kind of close reading for the class. That was my master's, and it never left me, I have to say. I found myself disagreeing, right? I mean, I couldn't believe when I read this text for myself. It seemed very strange to me that, like I had there's a cognitive dissonance because the piece of material I was reading about and all the historiography and the piece of material I actually read for my degree, for the master's seemed like a different piece of material. So, I worked on other things. I worked on other texts. I mean, the Haskalah was kind of in my orbit, but, the writers associated with it kept impinging on other work that I was doing. And I knew that I would eventually come back to it. And then this, when the editor of the series, the Rutgers Keyword series came to me, she wanted me to do a volume and she said, what do you want to do? And I didn't even have to think about it. I immediately said, I'm going to write about the Haskalah because it had never, all through graduate school, I kept circling around it and never quite getting to it. So this was a great opportunity. And I ended up writing this book, which, when I say this in the book, when I started, I wrote one draft where I thought I had written a book about the Jewish Enlightenment, which is what the field will tell you. And then by the time I finished, I realized that what I had was a book about Romanticism. So that's how it happened. And so it was a long time, but also a short time in the sense that it was a commissioned project that required me to kind of get my act together and think big thoughts as opposed to just working on a single text.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here in the episode, and listeners should bear with us. We're going to get to, context and where this is and what's going on and some of the important figures. And, as we've discussed off air, that there potentially is room here for multiple episodes. So if listeners enjoy this episode, please email us, give us feedback, and let us know your thoughts. But I think to start we have to define, just at least in briefly, before we even get to the major figures and the places where it is, what the Haskalah means. And also I want to emphasize, Haskalah is not Reform. This is not Reform Judaism. Okay, this is a common misconception for some reason that people say, Haskalah, you mean Reform. No, we don't. I will say that right off the bat. Olga, you can talk more about it, but it's not. We will talk. It's not only Mendelssohn. It's not only in Germany and Berlin. There are Haskalah changes in time and place. We're going to talk, we'll see how much we get to here in this episode, but there's Haskalah in Germany, and then there's Haskalah in Italy, and then there's Galicia, and there's Lithuania, and, moves all over the place. So that's, and these are different. These are not in the same Russia. These are not the same time period. We'll discuss those things. So let's just start off though. What does the word Haskalah mean? Define that, and then we'll get to when it started and what was going on.
So, your listeners know this. Also, the conventional translation, which has gotten things very confused, is enlightenment. And of course, this is deeply misleading. And when I started to work on this, it became instantly clear to me that there's a translation problem. And very often, the translation problems point to much bigger kind of conceptual problems of understanding. And so the real place to start when you think about the word Haskalah means if it is a version of the Jewish Enlightenment, there were other options, right? I mean, across the board in Europe, when people say Enlightenment, they maintain a kind of connection to the word light. And in fact, Shmuel Feiner, who writes about this a lot, wrote a book about the Jewish Enlightenment. In the Hebrew translation, he was very self-conscious. He didn't translate it as Haskalah. He translated it as Nerut, which is a kind of weird word, but maintains this connection with or, with light. So I started with this. I mean, the definition is where I started, right? I mean, this question of how we define this term. The term Haskalah has a very solid Jewish pedigree. It's not a translation of anything, which points already to a kind of self-consciousness on the part of these people who were associated with it, that they wanted a different word. So I'm sure your listeners know this. The word maskil, and the word Haskalah is pretty rare. Haskalah is a kind of reworking of biblical and medieval language, which uses the word maskil and sometimes the verb lahaskil. It's all over the biblical text, concentrated mostly in the Ketuvim section. It's used most frequently in the book of Daniel, which is actually very important. And I'm convinced that when the people I write about, thought about themselves as a group, they did not think of themselves as enlighteners. They were not looking at German or French examples of the philosophes and the Lumière. They were looking at Hebrew material. And for them, the word maskil came straight out of the biblical sources. And if you look at the biblical material, you learn a couple of different things about the word maskil. One thing that you learn is that, of course, it's connected to the word for intellect, to sechel, that's the root. But the other thing that you learn is that the word maskil, especially in Tehillim and in Daniel, both texts connected to writing and to a kind of interpretive activity. I think that they were thinking very hard and about it's a word that's very closely connected to proper speech, to the idea of decorum, of knowing what to say and what not to say. So, in the book of Daniel, the figure of the maskil is a figure of the interpreter, and a person who has a certain kind of aesthetic and moral vision, and special kind of knowledge. The other thing that's really interesting about the source of this word in Daniel is that this is Daniel, I'm sure you know, is a book that is set in the diaspora. And the idea of a maskil being a kind of diasporic reader, someone who mediates between the powers that be and the Jewish people, is very strongly associated with this word. And these people, the maskilim, had very good Hebrew. If they wanted to associate themselves with the Enlightenment, they would have done it. But in fact, they chose a completely different kind of word. So usually in the scholarship, the word modernist, the word enlightener, frequently, as you said yourself, the word reformer is associated with this movement. But, if you look at the material, it's not clear. First of all, that is not who these people are. Who these people are, and, before there was a Haskalah, there were maskilim. It's like nationalism, right? Before there was Tzionut, before there was Zionism, there were Tzionim, there were Zionists. This is the same thing. There were maskilim before Haskalah, before movement. So who were these people? These were intellectuals, mostly from the east of Europe, who found a kind of focus for themselves in Berlin for various reasons that which we can discuss, associated mostly with the literary activity kind of sponsored and organized by Mendelssohn, who was, in addition to all kinds of, he was all kinds of things, this man, but he was also a very prominent rabbi and biblical scholar. And he attracted to a kind of circle of Jewish intellectuals, maskilim, most of them graduates, and I advocate translating the word maskil as intellectual, who most of them graduates of the study house, who began this kind of literary work with Mendelssohn and other figures, Vesely, that we can talk about, and then the kinds of things that they were doing, associated mostly with literature and literary interpretation, spread further east and attracted more intellectuals who were interested in the kinds of questions that we're asking, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, what we're looking at is a movement that starts in the last quarter of the 18th century, and really, Nahi, never ends. There are maskilim walking around today. Okay, the death of the Haskalah has been greatly exaggerated. And I'll tell you something else. Most of those maskilim look more like you than like, a reform rabbi on Park Avenue. So in terms of the time span, right, we're talking about a movement that really has never ended. And a movement that Shmuel Ettinger, who's a very important Eastern European scholar, said that the Haskalah carries the water for every Jewish movement. So it carries the water, yes, in some ways it carries the water for reform, with which it is least qualified to be associated, but it also carries the water for Zionism, it carries the water for modern Orthodoxy, for all kinds of movements that started with this literary ferment in the end of the 18th century.
And the connection with reform is just, we'll get there. You mentioned Mendelssohn being, I just want to say this, we're going to get to him soon, being a rabbi. Interestingly, he never had smicha. He got, Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz gave him like a letter, but he did when he met Rabbi Yonasan, but he didn't give him an actual smicha. But yes, we'll get to Mendelssohn. Another term, the maskilim I think would greatly enjoy us starting their episode about them with philology and words, and I think this is classic, maskilic type thing, but secularization. This is a word in secular. This is a word on your great episode with J.J. Kimchi on his podcast of Jewish Ideas. You did an episode on Haskalah. You discussed this with him as well. And then the word secular and secularization, what that means and how that I think we should discuss that word and its connection or not a wrong connection to the Haskalah.
Well, another translation problem. So one of the issues is that English speakers don't have much choice. In America is such a big country, and it's important for many. English has become a kind of an intellectual reference point, not just in English-speaking countries, but elsewhere. And the word secular has had a kind of great press. But actually, in terms of applications to any kind of Jewish anything, any Jewish intellectual movement, any Jewish cultural development, it is grossly misplaced and deeply misleading. And the reason it is grossly misplaced and deeply misleading, especially in contrast with the word religious, which is how most people use it, is that this is a Christian word. And what it refers to, originally what it referred to, is, first of all, in general, it refers to a distinction in time between, the Christian idea of a post-redemptive state and the earthly time. But it was used in reference specifically to the appropriation on the part of the state of church property. So there are sort of moments of secularization, the most famous that some people might know about is when Henry VIII, in the aftermath of the English Reformation, appropriated for the state, closed down all the monasteries and took their land and sold it to the nobility. But there were lots of other, in the aftermath of the Reformation, there were lots of other instances like this, where property that belonged to religious organizations was appropriated by the secular state, and it also refers to a much larger set of developments where it wasn't just about real estate, right? It was about certain associations related to holiness, to sacrality, to morality that were now shifted from the church to the state. The problem here, and this is the reason the word secular is such a problem for us, is that secularization doesn't mean, just because things shift to the state doesn't mean they become less Christian. So the entire, the idea of secular as being somehow neutral or free of Christianity is a mistake. America, we have the separation of institutions of church and state, right? And we can talk about the American state being secular, but it doesn't make the American political culture any less Christian. So secularization doesn't work for Jews because the distinction doesn't exist for us. Everything is within the purview of halakha. Everything is within the purview of Jewish language, and there is no sphere that can be shunted off onto some other authority, right? It's impossible to think about that same kind of process in Jewish culture, and it is just not appropriate. And as far as the Haskalah is concerned, it's worse than the application of the term secular to them is worse than the application of the word reform. There is not a single secular source in any of the maskilic material that was produced between, let's say, the end of the 18th century and, the end of the 19th century. Not a single person associated with this movement was what, today we would call frei, right? They are all, they all keep kosher, they all keep Shabbat, they're all members in good standing there. Some of them are more, quote unquote, religious than people so this question of whether anything that they created can really be called what we call secular is it's a bad question. It's not that the answer is wrong. It's not the right way to ask the question. You see, I'm a Litvak. It's much more important to me. The kind of question we ask is even more important than the answer we give.
I think the waters are also muddied by the fact that today we're sitting here in the 21st century and we have Orthodox and modern Orthodox and we have all these kind of later creations, reform, conservative, that we put back on them, and we're going back to the maskilim. So I think that really leads us right into where we have to start off, which is what time period are we talking about when the Haskalah starts? Feiner, in his book, The Jewish Enlightenment, translated into English, it says, he talks about the pre-maskilim or early maskilim. So let's look right in the beginning. What is the period where, and we don't have to go in depth into this whole pre-maskilim, early maskilim, but what are the, let's start at the beginning. Let's call it the beginning. What's the time period? What's going on with the Jews? You already said mostly we're in Eastern Europe at this point, but where are we culturally and what's going on?
So one of the payoffs, one of the advantages to thinking about the Haskalah in terms of romanticism rather than in terms of the Enlightenment is that it helps us understand that the Haskalah is a kind of response, right, to what we could call the European Enlightenment. So any attempt to date it, we have to sort of assume that the Enlightenment already exists. And, so the background, right, you have to sort of, I'm not a huge fan of this, precursor, prehistory, I don't like any of that. What's the difference in prehistory and history? I mean, it seems like prehistory is history, just earlier. So, if you want a kind of temporal framework here, I think if the Haskalah is a literary movement, then we have to think about a point at which these people the maskilim began to think about themselves as somehow positioned differently, right, in relation to existing Jewish institutions. And I think that and positioned differently also in response to sort of what was going on in politics and society in the places where they lived. And to me, it seems like the most critical, the moment, right, when they begin to think about doing things in a different way or thinking about things and asking new questions or, writing new books. To me, it seems pretty clear that the beginning has to be the partitions of Poland between 1772 and 1795. Given where the maskilim mostly are, these are people who are most deeply affected by the partitions of Poland. 1772, there are three of them, just to give you a very basic information. This is an event, one of the most important events in European Jewish history, but also in European history that nobody cares about. But it completely reframed the political geography of where 75% of the world's Jews lived. And the way that it reframed it is in connection with the Enlightenment. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was one territory split between Poland and Lithuania, but sort of merged in a kind of single political unit. Between 1772 and 1795, this giant territory, which was bigger than France, was split between three different states: the Prussians, the Russians, and the Habsburg monarchy. So, Polish, what used to be called Old Polish Jewry, went under the jurisdiction of three different powers: the Prussians, the Habsburgs, and the Romanovs. In all three cases, these monarchies were what we would call enlightened absolutists, who were pushing for a kind of political program that set up the framework for reconstructing, among other things, they were interested in more than Jews, obviously, Jewish life. And so the kind of framework that they put in place provoked a response that we can call the inaugural moment of the Haskalah. And if you want a date, I'll give you a date: 1782. Okay, I mean, I'm like all dates, it's artificial. But if you want a date, here's a date for you: 1782. This is a moment that provokes a kind of response on the part of Mendelssohn's circle, on the part of Vesely, on the part of Mendelssohn. They're beginning to think about something new has happened. They're registering this enormously important event for every Jew who lives east of Berlin and east, or east of Hamburg. This is a really important event. And one of the reasons it's so important is, for the first time, the government's coming in and saying, look, you now are part of this enlightened political order, and saying this to the Jews. You have to organize your communities differently. You have to speak, you have to use the language of the state, and you have to become a part of the fabric of this new political order that's being created. And the question is, for the maskilim, the people who will define themselves as maskilim, well, what do we do about this? What does this mean for us? And they begin a kind of discussion begins about the implications of this political move of being removed from the jurisdiction of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I have a colleague, Moshe Rossman, in Israel, who refers to the Jews of Poland, Lithuania as this is the land of Torah, right? So the land of Torah is now under a new series of regimes that are looking to redefine, right? How do we redefine the relationship with the state? How do we redefine the relationship with our relationships with each other, with the Jewish community? And they begin, the literary response to the partitions is where I think we can start talking about the Haskalah. So right from the beginning, this is a movement that is not trying to institutionalize enlightenment. What they're doing is responding to enlightenment policy. And the responses range, right? It's not all one response, but what they have in common is they're saying, look, this needs from us some kind of response. What does this mean for us? Where are we headed? Right? And what is the Jewish community going to look like? And the reason they're in Berlin is that Berlin happens to be the seat of all of this intellectual ferment. It's where enlightened absolutism is formulated. Frederick the Great is a kind of exemplary monarch. So it's the right place and the right issue.
A lot to unpack. First of all, you want to define a little bit better enlightened absolutism?
So what's an enlightened absolutism is a new theory of the state that basically makes, there are all kinds of nuances, but the basic claim is that the state is the vehicle of enlightenment. But we associate enlightenment with democracy in the French Revolution. Here, enlightenment in Eastern Europe, enlightenment is the vehicle of enlightenment is the well-ordered, what's called the well-ordered police state that is going to institutionalize enlightened policy, that's going to put in place an administration and a bureaucracy that will transform the day-to-day life of the subjects of these kings. And it's like, and democracy doesn't even enter the issue. One way to think about this is that all these monarchies, the three powers, are benevolent for sure, but are also thinking that, they're looking very shortly, they'll be looking at the French Revolution and at the American Revolution and thinking, how can we prevent revolution from below? Because this is a disorder, this is dangerous, this is violent. What we're going to do is institute a kind of revolution from above. So that's the absolutism is a theory of governance, and it points to a kind of concentration of power at the center of the state. The state has beneficent authority. It imposes order, it imposes law, and it acts in the name of the enlightenment of its subjects. So that's what it is. And it's not an idea. It's an idea that has a moment, right, in European history. By the time the French Revolution comes, it doesn't look so good for the enlightened absolutists.
Yeah, this is before that. Napoleon will come to power later, and the emancipation of the Jews, and all this is going to be swirling around and going on and influencing the Haskalah. But before that, one other thing that we didn't mention, I know we said that Haskalah does not mean enlightenment. But the enlightenment, if you want to just briefly, we can briefly, the enlightenment, there's so much on the enlightenment, but for what is important for this podcast episode, the enlightenment, the figures and the basic thought, like when we mentioned enlightenment, because it definitely has an influence on the Maskilim, and especially even this way, just through, we'll get to the Emperor Joseph II's Edict of Tolerance shortly, but just briefly, a brief snapshot of the Enlightenment, if you will, as it pertains to this episode.
So one of the best way to think about this is to think about this in terms of what the Enlightenment does is it elevates the function of human reason to a kind of almost a divine capacity, right? Another thing that is a misconception is that the Enlighteners were sort of godless heretics. Most of them, the European ones, they were not. Many of them were actually deeply faithful people, but Christians and Jews, for whom reason was a kind of manifestation of the divine will in the world. And the reason was basically held up as the solution to all kinds of practical and cultural problems. There was a vision associated with the coming of reason a kind of transformative moment, right? Where all enlighteners were interested in was this, was in separating the medieval past from this great moment, this opportunity to introduce reason into state policy, into art, into social life, into relations between men and women. Reason was held up as a kind of arbiter and the great achievements in science and in the accumulation of human knowledge were held up as a kind of template for how people should conduct themselves. I mean, it was the translation of all of the great achievements of the scientific revolution into a social and political register. For the masculine, like all romantics, what they mostly worried about was the limitations of this program. If we do this, right, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for, what are the implications of using reason as a kind of arbiter of tradition, of social and political relationships? The scientific revolution is all fine, but what does it mean on the level of humanity? Can we talk about the science of humanity? Is it possible to apply the same standards of rationality that we apply to mathematics to human beings? So right away, the battle was joined, right? This question of what do you do with all of they were asking the same questions we're asking now. What are the implications of the cell phone for human relationships? This is the masculine question about how to translate scientific achievement and the use of rationality for, to get to the moon, right? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for how we should live together? So that is essentially the driving question of the Romantics. They are, for the first time, asking, it's a generation that is living already with the reality of enlightenment. And the masculine looking at enlightened absolutism in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, most of them, including Mendelssohn, are not 100% sure that this view of rationality that's so optimistic is really so good for human behavior.
And that's something we're going to get to shortly. And so, we mentioned the pre-masculine, early masculine, as you said. What does that mean, the masculine or not? I think what Feiner in his book, for those interested in read his Jewish Enlightenment, is referring to people that, I guess, are interested in science and secular culture or secular, not secular, not the word secular, but things that, see, there we go, using the English language. But they're interested in other things besides for just Torah sources, rabbinic sources, and they're trying to kind of blend the two. Anyways, to look in Feiner's book. But here, as we get to the Haskalah, as we say, the start of the Haskalah, as we're defining it here, and we get to 1782. So the Habsburg Emperor Joseph II, this Edict of Tolerance, you can explain what that is, and then that produces a response from Naftali Hertz-Wesley, Naftali Hertz-Wesley, and his Divrei Shalom Emes, which sets off a firestorm, and we'll get to his responses, and then Mendelssohn's Jerusalem, and so many things come from there. But let's start there with Joseph II's Edict of Tolerance and leading to Wesley's Divrei Shalom Emes.
So Joseph II, who the Habsburg Emperor, he actually set the tone for a lot of the other kinds of legislation, Jewish legislation, that would characterize the 19th century. And in some ways, he, even though the Edict of Toleration, had, I would say, its social impact is vastly overstated, but in the long-term view, of course, it was very important. So Joseph II wanted to, the experiment that he conducted in social policy really related. This is where the partition of Poland is so important. The Habsburgs inherited a piece of Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that's called Galicia. And some of your listeners, I'm sure, know where that is. It became eventually parts of it became part of Poland, and parts of it became part of Soviet Ukraine. But in the 18th century, it was the Habsburg territory that used to be Poland, used to be part of Poland. So, like all colonial governors, right? Very often what happens in the colonies is a kind of experiment that then will be tried out in the mainland. So, Galicia was a very poor area. The Habsburgs didn't do so well out of the partitions. The people who did the best out of the partitions were the Prussians. I mean, they got the richest and the most productive part of Poland in the deal. So, and Russia also, they just had, the greatest number of Jews. But the Galician territory wasn't so wonderful. And it was a very poor and underdeveloped area about which Joseph II was very concerned. So he attempted to introduce a kind of law that would give people incentive for reordering their social life. He wanted people to go to school. He made that possible. Not that there were so many schools on the ground in Galicia, but the Habsburgs wanted to put in a kind of experimental regime where Jews would be able to run their communities along much more enlightened lines, right? Where the communal regime would be better organized, where taxes would flow more smoothly into the coffers of the state. And among the various laws that he introduced in this toleration patent, right, was the encouragement of Jews to learn German, to send their kids to secular. I mean, they didn't exist, right? I mean, we're talking about a very rudimentary kind of educational apparatus. And the idea ultimately was that Jews would be brought into the empire along the same kinds of lines as other political subjects. So he officially extended his protection as an enlightened monarch, to this community. And he wanted, one of the other things that he wanted to do, he wanted to create a class of Jewish bureaucrats who would actually be themselves trained to reorganize the community along these lines. I got to tell you, Joseph II did not really care about the beliefs of the Jews who lived in Galicia. Many of them were Hasidim, but that was not a concern for Joseph II. What he was interested in was a more streamlined communal organization and access to schools, and access to German. So when this law was passed, even though its impact, it was already clear that the question of how much it would really change the lives of Galician Jews was not entirely clear. But for the Maskilim, for some of them, for Vesely, who was actually, he was not Galician himself, but the state of his brethren in Eastern Europe worried him, like it worried a lot of the other Mendelssohn's fellow disciples. And he wrote a pamphlet in which he characterized Polish Jewry, right, pre-partition Jewry, as benighted and ignorant. And he argued that this law boded very well for the future of Jews who should take advantage of the opportunities provided by Joseph II and by his law. But the other thing that he did, and this is what, the other thing that Divrei Shalom V'Emet was a kind of publicity pamphlet for a project that Vesely himself was participating in under Mendelssohn's leadership, the publication of the Biur. So he said, what we're doing here is exactly in the spirit of this new law. He put together Mendelssohn with Joseph II, and he said, look, this is a great moment for us because in our own community, we're trying to figure out how to be better readers and how to have better command of the biblical text. And at the very same time, here's this king who is also interested in our becoming more organized, more educated, giving us opportunities. So he wrote this pamphlet, and the truth is that the tone was the most offensive thing about it. What he actually said, the practical recommendations that he made were not so radical. The idea that Jews should study other languages was pretty common. Nobody, they all had to anyway, because that's how you made a living. You had to know other languages to survive. So this idea that, he wanted to introduce a Jewish educational system run more along enlightened lines, well, that's a great proposal, but it's not exactly earth-shaking. What people objected to, and what really made them, what catalyzed Mendelssohn's disciples into a movement, was this idea that Jews were now living under a new dispensation, and they were entering modernity, where they now had to deal with governments that were promoting a different kind of social order that would be run along more rational lines. And that was the issue that to which demanded a response.
Yeah, so a number of things to talk about with Wesley, and this is not a podcast on Wesley, though we can do an episode on Wesley. Wesley from Hamburg. He lived in Copenhagen, but he was a Talmud of Rabbeinu and Eibeshitz. He learned under Rabbeinu and Eibeshitz, and he later on, well, first of all, everyone should look up a picture of him. He's got his wig. He looks like I think Shimon Steinmetz wrote on the main line. He looks like he belongs on Money. And if you look at the picture of him, and Wesley ends up spending a good chunk in Amsterdam and in Berlin, and then later on again in Hamburg, where he dies. And so Wesley sees this and he writes a Divrei Shalom. There's two things in there I think that really set off. First of all, he tries to distinguish between Teres Adam, I think he calls it, and Teres Hashem, Teres Elikim. He spread the two ethics. He's very big. He has a lot of books on morals and ethics and philology and words in many of his earlier works. And then he has Divrei Shalom. And the other thing he says is he has a line where he says, "Kol Talmud Chacham she'ein bo derech eretz nevelas shrucha toiv imenu." If a Talmud Chacham doesn't have derech eretz, there's no basic things, then a rotten carcass is better than him. And this set off obviously the night of Yehuda, Rabbi Haskalah in Prague, who gave a sermon, and there's two, went after him, and as well as Rabbi David Tevli of Lisa. And interestingly, both of them had written kind of Haskamas. So the Night Yehuda was a Michtav Bracha for Wesley's commentary in Levanon on Perkei Avos prior. They did, and Night Yehuda says, I read your earlier book, Gan Nol, on words, and I greatly enjoyed it. He says very much he enjoyed it, and he says he actually says he doesn't give haskamas, but ava milgalgeles as a shura, like milgalgeles as a shura. It's very interesting. It's very interesting haskama to read, and he says I really enjoyed your works. He actually even there says that I know that I don't usually give it, but I know you probably don't have apicursus or whatever. And then he sees this and he goes crazy on the whole thing. So there's just a lot that's interesting. And then Wesley, as I don't know if I mentioned, responds back with a letter, and then he enlists the Italian rabbis to back him. Some do, some don't. And then there's a third and a fourth letter, and he goes on and on. He spends a lot of time with this before eventually just it dies down or whatever happens with it. And Wesley, just to mention here briefly, once we're discussing it, first of all, Rabbi Elazar Fleck's Shuv Me'ava quotes Wesley. There's a letter at the beginning of one of his, I think Avas David, or one of the works where he quotes, there's a letter from a Masher HaGadol. Wesley's son, much later, many years later, after Wesley dies, publishes part of his commentary on Bereshis, which was recently actually published completely from manuscript, but he publishes it and he gets a haskama from the Aruch LaNer, Yaakov Ettlinger, and he says, Harav, Hagoy, and he gives all sorts of titles to Wesley. This is well after the controversy. Hirsch quotes Wesley extensively in his commentary from Vayikra, which is part of the beer that Wesley wrote is the Mendelssohn Vayikra. Mendelssohn, and we'll get back to him in a second. So Wesley is quoted by many. There was actually a series of articles in the Beis Aaron Yisrael, the Stolin periodical, where it was written on Wesley, and at one point the writer there, one of the articles talks to all the Rabbanim that quote Wesley and quote his works, and it's a lot. So a lot quote him. So again, we're not wading into the complete Wesley controversy, but this whole Divrei Shalom MS controversy actually was just reprinted through Mosad Bialik, brand new, just now by Professor Shmuel Feiner with notes, and we haven't seen it yet. But what's interesting about it is, and if you read the first and the second where he responds, you read Wesley's program, and this is something what you were saying, Olga, that, and we'll get to this later, but we're all maskilim, not we're all, but there are maskilim today, and how the maskilim, it's so hard to compare today's Judaism, all the different types to then, is that Wesley's program is basically literally what we do, at least talking here from Lakewood, from America. He says we should learn, the languages. We speak English in schools, right? We should learn language, we should learn basic math and history, and he even says in Hebrew we should teach them Yedias Klalias, basic facts before they start off learning, and they should learn Chumash and basic Diktuk. These are things that all children today learn to some extent or other. This is his program. This program that they want to put a chayrim and they wanted to go against him. This is literally the program that we do today. So we'll return to that. But just interesting to note, so we this, but this ignites a controversy, this whole thing. And then Night Yehuda says, Night Yehuda is in Habsburg, he's in Prague, and he says, "Oh, I'm not saying anything against Emperor Joseph II." But as you say, it's the attitude, it's Wesley's things that he says that really seems to set off the Night Yehuda and others.
So, first of all, I just want to say one very quick thing about his famous. There are two things about this Divrei Shalom V'Emet that made him notorious. And it's amazing how he was rehabilitated in rabbinic opinion. That just kills me. But so those, first of all, the Noda Yehuda took it personally. The comment about the Talmid Chacham, who is like a carcass without derech eretz. This was a kind of indictment of the rabbinical class. And but you have to read this line in context, right? This is one member of the intellectual aristocracy talking to other members. The dialogue is entirely internal. It's the kind of internal insult, it's a kind of diss that only one Talmid Chacham could deliver to another, right? And this concept of derech eretz you can see, as soon as you translate it as secular knowledge, you get into trouble. But of course, that's not what it is. Derech eretz is a kind of basic, as you said yourself, Vesely was obsessed with the moral condition of contemporary Jewry. What Rav is not obsessed at any time with the moral condition of the Kehillah? And what worried him was precisely the low moral state of the study house, of the Best Medrash. So this was an encouragement to a moral improvement based on entirely acceptable Talmudic categories, number one. But this is not, so for the rabbinate to say this thing, right? Of course it made people very angry. But it's completely within the purview of internal Jewish dialogue. The idea of this kind of self-critique is part and parcel of the rabbinic tradition. But really, the problem was not that. It's what you said. It's the attitude. Vesely, the Noda Yehuda said, look, we already do. And his response, he says, we already send our kids to school. We don't need you to tell us how to conduct ourselves. Who are you? His problem was assigning this kind of significance, earth-shaking significance, to the time. Says, Joseph II is a good king. He's good to us. But who says that, after he dies, there will be some, his heir will forget all of the tolerance and will oppress us. So it's this kind of, the assignment of significance to this time. And I have to tell you something. The Noda Yehuda was not alone in issuing this critique. You know who else criticized Vesely for this attitude towards time? Mendelssohn. In Jerusalem, which is the other important book of the moment, Mendelssohn says there's no progress in affecting large social groups. History is not moving towards a happy ending that we can identify. This is implicitly a critique of Vesely's attitude towards Joseph II. He says progress is for the individual person. Moral growth happens to the individual. So you have here a very interesting conjunction. Vesely makes this statement, and who does he get, a spanking from? He gets it from the Noda Yehuda on the one hand, and the same issue upsets Mendelssohn too. For the Haskalah, and for all Jews, the question of how we evaluate modernity. What does it mean to live in a democratic country? What does it mean to live under the tolerance patent? Where is our history going? What should we do about it? This is an internal debate among Jewish intellectuals. This is not an ideological kind of split between, this kind of person and that kind of person. This is what Jewish intellectuals are talking about. This is a burning question for them. Just because Vesely has this opinion doesn't mean that the Haskalah was, quote unquote, secular or modernist. He puts the issue on the table. He says, let's talk about it. And opinions varied. Most Maskilim actually did not agree with Vesely. Most Maskilim agreed with the Noda Yehuda and with Mendelssohn. That modernity was a very risky time and that it was not necessarily a movement towards progress. And in this respect, they were not reformers and they were not secular. Because they wanted to make people sensitive to the idea that what was happening under the enlightened rule of either the absolutist kings or the democratic state had its darker side. So Vesely was an important catalyst, but actually he did not set the tone. He asked the right question. You see how important it is to ask the right question? He asked the right question. His answer, not so good, but his question, 100%.
it's a fascinating text to read for those interested. Now that it's been redone through Mossad Bialik, and it's something that it's surprising it took this long. And then you read the other ones where he apologetically he defends himself. And again, maybe it's not. I know some of them some say that he's apologetic, he's just backtracking. But you can read it. And the second letter is interesting because he talks out of both sides of his mouth. He says he appeals to all the Rabbanim, and he also hits back at unnamed, who we know is the Nedi Yehuda and Abdav Tevli Elisa, and then the Hafla. We know he's hitting back at them pretty hard. And then in the third and the fourth, eventually he just scales it down. And the Italian Rabbanim do defend him. A number of them do defend him, come to his aid, and say it's okay. And so but the other thing about Wesley is to read it is that it's full of rabbinic allusions, right? He's quoting Chazal, he's quoting his other Sfarim, he's quoting Sfarim extensively. That's what he's doing. It's not a book, and although he does, put Joseph II on this pedestal. And as you say, Mendelssohn comes back. Mendelssohn has his reservation about it. The other kind of controversy at this time is the beer. And the beer is something that, so Mendelssohn puts this literary project where with Dubno and Wesley and others, where Mendelssohn translates into German the Chumash, and you have a collection of Dubno writing the commentary on Bereshis, Mendelssohn doing Shemais, Wesley doing Vayikra, Yaroslav doing Bamidbar, and Hertz Hamburg doing Dvarim, and you have them putting out this project that also draws the ire of Nedi Yehuda and others, this project that they do. But, this too is kind of an interesting thing as well, the beer.
Beer also has this reputation for being a kind of move in the direction of reform, in the direction of a German biblical text, etc. But actually, and I talk about this in my book, if you look at what they're doing, this is a deeply conservative project, because one of the things, and this is something, for us, where you can go online on, Sefaria, and, every Jewish text on the planet is available online. For us, we take it for granted, and, how we educate our kids, right, takes it for granted. The Tanakh is a kind of basic, this is the primary Jewish text. But in the 18th century, and this is something that you really need to think about very hard. The Tanakh, or the Chumash, was read in shul, right? And people had access to it every week. But there was no Jewish culture of Bible reading. That's what the Protestants did. Who read the biblical text? There was in elementary school. In Cheder, you learned sort of parts of it, but this kind of what we take for granted as, reading the Chumash was not what people did in the 18th century. Jewish education was heavily Talmudic, and the people who read the Bible, what we call the Bible in English, on a regular basis was women. The Tzena Rena is the most popular version of the biblical text that Jews have in the 18th century. And the reason that Mendelssohn and company wanted to initiate this project was that they wanted a respectable biblical text for Jewish children and Jewish men to read. They were worried mostly about the fact that there was a Taich Chumash in Yiddish that was being taught to kids by women. This wasn't very nice, but it's certainly not modernism. This is a kind of conservative move to take the Chumash out of the hands of uneducated women and to transfer it into the jurisdiction of men, and to provide Eastern European men with a kind of respectable and elevated and well-informed commentary that would not be, they saw it as elevating the biblical text. So we're not talking about a kind of secularization of the Chumash. What we're talking about here is, once again, just like Vesely's letter, an internal discussion among the Jewish intellectual elites about the production of culture and about the future of Jewish education. A moral education and Jewish education, right? Not secular, but how are we going? They're very worried. What's going to happen, right? If people have corrupt texts, if people are not being socialized properly into Jewish life, we're going to have these Talmidei Chachamim who have no derech eretz, and who are going to be, in the context of these new policies that are making it easier for Jews to become middle class, what's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to Jewish life under these circumstances? And given how we live today, I got to tell you, Nachi, I think the Maskilim had good reason to worry.
And that's something that we'll get to a little bit more in a while. So what's interesting is Mendelssohn and Wesley Mendelssohn learns under David Frankel, the author of Carbon Ada, on Yerushalmi, his yeshiva education. Wesley learns under Bionis and Eibeshitz. And some of these others learned, so these Maskilim in the beginning, they learned in yeshiva, that they had yeshiva education, they had a Gemara education, that this is what they did, and yet they're not Rabbanim, though. They don't have smicha, really. They're not Rabbanim. They're not part of the rabbinic elite, so to speak. And they're suddenly a player. And this is something that, and Feiner outlines this in a couple of chapters about Divrei Shalom V'emes when it comes to that controversy, and they're suddenly hitting back. And Rafal Cohen of Hamburg wanted to hit back, and Mendelssohn and others, and then some non-Jews get involved, and they're going to put pressure on the Jews on the rabbin. Usually the Rabbanim had the preview. They were in control. So this is something that we do see with the Haskalah coming out, where you do have kind of the lay people, so to speak. This is something else that starts happening at the time. And, we mentioned... Mm-hmm.
First of all, they're not lay people, because that is another Christian concept that I object to very strongly. We're talking about two institutions here that are native to Jews, the Beis Medrash and the Beit Knesset, right? These are two institutions that organize Jewish life. And what you got to know about the rabbinate is that the rabbinate is tied financially and professionally to the Beit Knesset, to the Kahal. This is, in the early modern period, the rabbinate was completely professionalized, and instead of people who had a kind of reputation for Torah learning and, had money and had a kind of financial independence, a real elite, what we now have is a much bigger rabbinical class that now serves a much bigger population that's increasingly being hired and fired by the laity. And and one of the reasons that women begin to play an increasingly important role in the early modern Jewish community is that they are, of course, part of the synagogue system. They're, for the first time in the early modern period, women come back to the synagogue. Polish synagogues were built without a women's section. All of a sudden, in the 18th century, the architecture changes completely. And for the first time, in a very long time, women are not in a separate building. They're now in shul. So the laity is now hiring and firing rabbis, and they become in some ways, a more powerful class, but they become much more important politically, but the connection to Torah learning is more attenuated. And it's a real problem, because for the first time, the prestige of scholarship doesn't map on so easily onto a respectable rabbinic, I've heard this phrase from my students. There's now this entity called the rabbi entrepreneur. So and now the first time we have, rabbis with a kind of entrepreneurial political spirit is during this period. So they're running the Beit Knesset. But where do rabbis come from? Where are they educated? In the Beis Medrash. But because of this kind of split between these two institutions, most of the Maskilim are coming out of the Beis Medrash. They're not getting jobs because there aren't enough jobs to go around. And you have a kind of disaffected, discontented intelligentsia, this intellectual class that is in a position to critique the established rabbinate. And Nachi, this problem does not go away. In the 19th century, it becomes worse. Because as the culture of the study house grows, where the prestige of Torah learning is so important, and as Hasidut begins to spread, there is a kind of a clash between the Torah values of the Beis Medrash and what's going on in the synagogues. And the Haskalah is all about this, right? And of course, the rabbis get upset, right? Because these troublemakers who have just as much learning, maybe more, they're critiquing the laity that's in a position to fire the guy, who's working in the shul. So you have here and entirely, and the Enlightenment plays into this, because now the Gentile powers are in a position to kind of handpick who they're going to sponsor. And there is a kind of, what happens, when the authorities get involved into an internal Jewish dispute? The outcome is not so good for Jewish solidarity. So that one way to understand the Haskalah is to look at it from the perspective of internal Jewish politics. This is the best medrash. These are the discontented, very smart, highly educated intellectuals like Vesely, who are critiquing the standing communal regime. This is clearly not new. But it doesn't mean that what you have here is a Kulturkampf between the secular and the religious. That's the last thing it is.
Correct. These are not Freya people, as you said before. This is not reform. I'm going to get to that in a second. The other thing about them, though, is they are, some of them, cultured. Mendelssohn is mingling with non-Jews. They are cultured. Wesley's wearing a wig. They have, this is something that they are. They're not necessarily like their Western European counterparts and just sitting and learning Gemara all day or Hasidish. It is a little different.
Except that, we should not take Vesely and Mendelssohn with the wig and the non-Jews as indicative. Because, yes, it is true, Vesely and Mendelssohn had a great deal of prestige. But most masculine, we're talking about 2 out of 500, right?
Yep.
Most masculine were exactly like those guys you're describing, sitting in the best medrash all day and reading a lot and thinking about their future employment prospects. They were no different, and they certainly didn't dress different. In Eastern Europe, they did not look any different than any other from Jew. And I got to tell you, there were lots of Jews who were, not masculine, who dressed Western and who put on the hats and the coats and who had, because of their business interests, circulated in the world. In some ways, the masculine, the intellectuals who sat in the best medrash, were more closed off to the world than some of these merchants who wore the frock coats and who wore the hats and who wore the boots and who looked more like their Gentile neighbors than they did like, what you would consider a Jewish-looking person.
It is something that happened. So I posted the Divrei of MS on the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community when it came out. I post, all new books and new Sfarim, and I said just because I post things, not an endorsement, so on. And I get a comment from somebody, and he sends me like an emoji. So he says, "It's Haskalah. Your Zaidi would have been put in Chayrim and kicked out of yeshiva for reading it." He says, "I don't need to read the New Testament to render judgment." Anyhow, meanwhile, where they read Haskalah literature. In yeshiva, in Volozhin. Well, we're not there yet, but again, just putting it aside, the whole conversation, Divrei Shalom, and Wesley and Mendelssohn, much more to discuss, and the controversies there, and the beer, and of course, many Rabbanim that push back. We're upset about it. Yeah, we will move forward. And so, the thing that listeners are probably like, wait, you're an hour into this episode, you're telling me that Haskalah is a good movement, that Haskalah all good from Torah observant Jews? What are you saying? This is not what I was told in yeshiva. What's going on? So, as I hear you say that there, but at what, where does the conception come from then, that everybody has in their mind, the Haskalah? Yeah.
So so how did the Masculine become the stepchildren of Jewish history? So first of all, I have to tell you that the Frum community is not the only community that doesn't like them. You know who else doesn't like them? The Zionists, right? Because they have the same reputation for secular, for reform, for assimilationist, et cetera, et cetera. They're the whipping boy for both communities. So how did this happen? Well, it happened. Let's just start with the Zionists because in many ways it's easier. So it happened. There was a moment at which basically the so-called Zionist revolution, which wasn't really a revolution, disowned their Maskilic forefathers because in some ways because they were younger and they wanted there was a kind of resistance to this idea that they felt like Mendelssohn was blamed for not being a nationalist. For not being sufficiently progressive and for not seeing that, the solution. This is the irony, right? Mendelssohn was too conservative, the Zionists felt, and didn't see the political future that opened up before the Jewish people, and didn't see the nation and the state as the proper political solution to assimilation, to discontinuity, to deracination, to all kinds of problems that we now associate with the coming of modernity. So, in a certain sense, they were right because the Maskilim were actually deeply hostile to the idea that the state is the solution to everything. From the point, and which is interesting, right? So for the Zionists, they were in some ways too conservative, too liberal, not radical enough. But for the and it's not just, not for all rabbis, because first of all, that's also a misconception. I mean, there were many rabbis in the Litvish world that were deeply sympathetic to the Maskilik program. But the resistance that they got was mostly, you're not going to be shocked to hear this, was from many Hasidic communities. And as most of the Eastern European Jewish world became increasingly sympathetic, and I have a colleague named Glenn Dinner, who you should have on your program, who writes about Hasidut. His first book was about the Hasidic conquest of Poland. And he uses the word conquest in his title because that's what it was, right? I mean, this kind of the increasing importance of Hasidut and of Hasidic literature to every Jewish community in Eastern Europe changed the kind of framework for the reception of the Haskalah. And for many people, what they associated, I mean, this is going to sound bizarre, for many, the laity, the community associated with Maskilik ideas was basically like Lithuanian, it was the Litvaks, right, who were the evil ones. And so, the more Hasidish the tonality and the world became, the Jewish world became, the mode of devotion, the kind of education that most people got, what they learned about Yiddishkeit. I mean, all of this was so heavily inflected by Hasidic literature that this kind of the intellectual attitude associated with the Haskalah was tarred with. It was again another instance of the struggle between the community, increasingly sympathetic to Hasidism, and these intellectuals who were coming out of the world of the Beis Medrash. Many of them did not have jobs, and many of them, the way they made their living was outside of the community. So this kind of independence put them at a distance. And, gradually over time, right? I mean, these kind of attitudes became more entrenched and nobody could tell the difference anymore between a Reform rabbi and a maskil. But because, for Eastern Europeans, the maskilim were right there, right? They were the closest. So they became demonized, right? Associated with the kinds of developments that they themselves resisted.
It also didn't help that the Maskilim and the Hasidim were at at loggerheads very often. And so you see that, Yosef Pearl in Galicia, and Shir, Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, the Ktsaisa son-in-law who goes on to become Rabbi of Prague. Mm-hmm. They hated Hasidim. I mean, Pearl wrote Megalat Mirin, but said that he went after them. Those have been by the new edition of Pearl's works and in English. I mean, they went after Hasidim. They threw Hasidim in jail. I mean, they really went at. They held Hasidim was like the worst thing ever. So, and them and many other Maskilim. That didn't help.
I have to put on my historian's hat for a second here because, today in the 21st century, most people, when they look at Hasidus, they think of it as basically a synonym for Jewish tradition. But in the early 19th century, the Hasidim were radicals. I mean, it was the Maskilim, it was the entire Litvish world, right? The Beis Medrash that was the conservative Jewish traditional Judaism. I mean, that was how Pearl was objecting to these crazy radicals that drank and smoked and did somersaults and shul.
Singing.
The Hasidim were the counterculture. And so, of course, when the counterculture became the culture, they struck back at their enemies. So, once again, we have here a kind of internal Jewish argument that has been, what's the worst thing you can say about a Jew? You're an apostate, you're a meshumad, you're a troublemaker, you're a mesit, right? I mean, so that's the worst kind of insult. So what you have here is an internal struggle over meaning, a legitimate kind of machloket about what does it mean to live as a Jew, right? That is now the terms are being, it's translated into, you are the apostates, right? You are the non-Jews. That's the worst thing you can say to a Jew.
Yeah, and another thing is that I think we talked about Mendelssohn and Wesley. We spent even probably too much time on them. And Mendelssohn is considered, Shmuel Feiner in his biography of Mendelssohn says that Mendelssohn on both sides, he's upheld by even, today's historians, wherever it is, Mendelssohn, he is the everything. No, it's too much. And on the other side also, it's overplayed on both ends with him and Wesley and others, with him specifically, and then Wesley and others, but also the Haskalah changes. And the Haskalah change, we started off in the early where it starts there in Berlin and Eastern Europe, but the Haskalah changes when you move to Galicia, when you go to Lithuania, when you go to Russia, when you go to Italy. I mean, it's totally different when you get to Chadal and Reggio and Almansi and all the other figures there. It's a totally different world there. And then you go to, Lillian Bloom later and all the other figures that are Levinson in Russia and other figures that are going around in Vilna. And it's very, very, very different in time and place. And that's another important aspect to highlight here, is that the Haskalah isn't one movement in one place, one person and as a head of it. I think people think today it's like Mendelssohn was the head. He had this like yeshiva and everybody just came out and there was Talmidim. Like, no, that's not what happened. Even if they were influenced by Mendelssohn and others, that's not exactly how it was. And these people were in different countries. They went to their different. Everything was different, right? They had different cultural background, different cultural context where they were from.
You have to think about this less as a political party and an ideology. Mendelssohn died in 1786. So, I mean, we're not talking about a kind of crystallized, segment that you could, this was their ideology and they had a leader. That's why I object. The word Haskalah should not be capitalized. It should have, when you transliterate it into English, it should have a lowercase h. Because Haskalah just means, when I went to day school to Flatbush in the 6th grade, I had a teacher, Mrs. Rosenwasser. I think she must have been Lakewood or Passaic. She was very frum and, wore a sheitel. And we had one of the things, she was my Judaic teacher, right? So this was 6th grade. So we had one of the things that she taught was she called it, we had it once a week. She called it Haskalah Klalit. She was not a masculine, Mrs. Rosenwasser, I can guarantee you, okay? But to her, what is Haskalah Klalit? It's general knowledge, right? General intellectual development. To her, the word had no uppercase H. So the Haskalah was not a movement. It was it was basically a kind of intellectual orientation, right? And people who saw themselves as Jewish intellectuals in every country in Europe. And actually this goes back to Jews do this too. There's no clerics. Jews don't have a church. They have people associated with the synagogue, right? With the Bet Knesset, who perform certain services for the community. Rabbis included. They have poskim, but they also have this institution called the Bes Medrash, which cultivates the mind. It's Jewish system of higher learning. So these are intellectuals who are born and bred in these institutions. One of the things that makes them different from, intellectuals in previous Jewish settings, they have one thing that these other people didn't have. They have print. So to them, reaching out to the community through books becomes their vehicle of communication. They don't have political rallies. They don't have clubs. They don't have parties. They write. And they create an apparatus that makes it easy for Jewish readers like you and Jewish readers like me to be open to the world of Jewish books. And that's why we can talk about the Haskalah, even though socially the people in Trieste, in Italy, were very different from the people in Vilna. What did they have in common? They had Hebrew and they had the Jewish book. So they could talk to each other across frontiers. And they had a population of readers in every community that was sometimes not sympathetic to everything that they wrote, but that really wanted to read what they had to say. So that's, on the one hand, that's a very small thing because they didn't have like a power base. On the other hand, that's a huge thing because to change the reading habits of a people is not small. And if you think about, some other Jewish revolutions that have happened in the past, most of them were about changing reading habits. You can look at the spread of Kabbalah in this way, at Hasidus, even at the Talmud, right? All these revolutions started as revolutions in reading. And so I look at Haskalah, to me, it has a lowercase h. It is a movement. It's not an intellectual movement, but a movement of intellectuals. That's very different.
Yeah, and like I said, Haskalah differs it differs in place and time. And this Haskalah is something that they were interested in. Some of them we do see there are differences in that Maskilim did read more non-Jewish. There were some of them reading non-Jewish literature, non-Jewish, whatever that is. Don't want to stay away from the word secular, but reading, math, and they were reading history and different things. They were different. And then you see in Germany, the Rabbanim, they were going to university, and definitely different things did change. And you had then in the other world, a lot of the early Jews, Rabbi Dr. David Katz, who has his own podcast, he always says, a lot of, they were Gemara. That's how his quote is. And that's a lot of them were Gemara. The non-masculine sources, no, we don't do any of that. And there was pushback to that as well. And then you obviously have Hasidim. Rabbi Yeshua Inbal, or a prolific author in Israel now, he put out a book recently called Neorot v'Haskalah, and he tried to give a whole history of Haskalah and his take on it through Mosad of Kook. And one of the things that he, as I recall, I don't have it in front of me, that he argues is that the Chassam Sofer's famous adage, Chodesh Asim Min HaTorah, is not referring to Haskalah. It's referring to reform.
Right.
There's a distinction. And I think that's very important. And that's something we need to highlight here. And we said this earlier. There is Reform Judaism and there is Haskalah. They are not the same thing. And so many people, when I told them I was going to do something on Haskalah, say, oh, it's reform. It's not. Now, I want you to, I just wanted to say one more thing. I want you to discuss that. What Reform Judaism is when it starts. And, there were some that were part of, Wissenschaft. There were kind of historians like Geiger, but they were not. And some, when people, it's shocking. You tell people, oh, Shadal, who they know of as a Maskil, and Shadal fought vehemently against Geiger and reform. And the Maskilim, many of them hated reform and said, no, this is not, you can't do reform, Reform Judaism as we know it now. You can't, no, that's not Judaism.
First of all, I can, the proof is very easy, right? Reform Judaism is two things that you need to know. First of all, Reform Judaism is a movement that started with the laity. It was not led by the rabbinate anywhere. The earliest Reform congregations in places like Hamburg happens to be the earliest one. It became a model for other Reform congregations. This is strictly a lay idea. They attract the rabbinic leadership, but, this is part of the entire development of professionalization that goes back to the early modern period. If there's going to be a congregation, they're going to find a rabbi to lead it, okay? But the initiative is purely lay. It is not connected to the Maskilim by personnel. The other difference is that, and no Maskil ever served as a rabbi for any Reform congregation. So we have here a fundamental split in personnel. But the other issue is geography. So the Reform movement is associated basically with northern Germany, with Hamburg and Berlin also, but it spreads from the north. Every place where the Maskilim, where Jewish intellectuals were a force, the Reform movement failed. So there were no Reform congregations in Lithuania. There were no Reform congregations. I mean, in places like Vienna, yeah, but not anywhere, but where there was a substantial kind of presence of Maskilim. I mean, none of them were involved in anything that you would call a reform. And in fact, the few times where a Maskil attempted to intervene with local authorities to introduce some kind of reform, he crashed and burned. The most famous example of this is Isaac Mayer Dick in Vilna, who attempts to put his name. He was a very prolific and popular writer. He wrote in Yiddish and in Hebrew. He was read, he's completely forgotten now, but he was a Maskil who was read widely. And he sold a lot of books. He was the only writer of, who actually, among the Maskilim, who actually made money. But he attempted in the 1840s to put his name on a reforming project sponsored by the local laity who wanted to reform Jewish dress. So he attempted to affiliate himself with this, and the whole project crashed and burned. And he basically retreated from this effort and never stuck his neck out again and continued to write books that sold, many copies. So you have, every place where the Maskilim lived, and every time, the few times that they got involved in some kind of reforming effort, the whole thing collapsed. So most of them were deeply hostile to reform. And, Shadal is a great example. He thought that this entire, the entire kind of, German effort to create a new kind of congregation was a terrible idea. I mean, most of the Maskilim opposed any service that was non-traditional and not in Hebrew. And most of them, none of them that I can think of that were prominent were members of Reform congregations. Even members, forget leaders. So this, I don't, of course, it's easy to see in retrospect how they got tarred with the same brush. It's that word assimilation and the word secularization. But Inbal is right. 100% right. The Khatam Sofer was, what enraged him, was the reform movement. But that is not the same thing as a Haskalah by a long stretch.
Right. Exactly. And that's important to point out. And then, this is reform movement is something totally different. And then the forerunner, precursor conservatives, like Harry Frankel and Breslau, that whole controversy with Darkei Mishnah, that's a whole separate thing. Mm-hmm. Again, those are separate things. That's not what we're discussing. Now, What about the later Maskilim? One that I know you're interested in, Muslim Lillian Bloom and his Chatas Na'urim and other books. You mentioned earlier that all the Maskilim were Shemer Torah Mitzvahs. They were all religious. They weren't what we'd call fry. They weren't off. But then you get to Lillian Bloom and others that things do change at some point.
Well, so things change for everybody. First of all, the 50-year difference, first of all, the kind of opportunity, intellectual, cultural, economic opportunities that people have are very different than what they were in the last quarter of the 18th century. And one of the things to keep in mind here is that the Jewish world in general is changing. And so you put the Maskilim, the problem with the Jewish world is that we give way too much credit to intellectuals. Intellectuals are people who have a lot of impact on the way most of us live our lives. The Jewish world, the laity, the same laity that in Germany was putting up Reform congregations, the same laity that's sending their kids to university, that's taking advantage of the new commercial order, that is giving their daughters piano lessons. The whole world is changing, right? There's a whole context which is a cultural context that's very different in the late 18th century to the mid 19th century. The Maskilim are still worried about the same things, but the what we could call the kind of openness of the Jewish community to new economic opportunities, to new educational opportunities. All these students who are not going to university, many of them not because they're so intellectual or so ideological, but because they want to make a living. So for the Maskilim, the problem is essentially much bigger. And what happens by the mid-centuries, that people who are writing in Hebrew, those same intellectuals who had more cultural standing, who could still attract the kind of controversy that Vesely attracted, they're increasingly marginal to the Jewish world, both from the point of view of the deeply kind of pious Hasidic communities. By this point, Hasidism is huge. But they're also marginal to the secular, it's what we call secular frei, right? The Jews who are going about their business and don't feel the need to go to synagogue, who are just doing their thing. And this question of whether you're going to invest your money in hiring a Hebrew teacher for your kid, or you're going to invest your money in putting your kid into university, for a lot of people, it's a serious question. So the Maskilim are becoming increasingly marginal, increasingly nervous about the fate of Jewish intellectual life, increasingly alienated both from the Hasidic mainstream and from the Jews who are increasingly non-observant and who are interested much more in theater and opera and, French, German literature and in going abroad and, who are really completely disconnected. So for a lot of people, what you start to see in Maskilic writing, in Maskilic poetry, and Maskilic fiction is a much darker mood. A mood that says, this is bad. We knew it was bad before, but it's much worse now. Judah Leib Gordon, who's the foremost Maskilic poet of the mid-19th century, is basically convinced that no one is reading him, that no one cares what he has to say, and that Hebrew is dying. It's a language that is on its last legs. And, that neither the laity, the masses are not reading it, and the kind of the wealthy middle-class Jews aren't reading it either. And what you have the kind of work that the masculine begin to produce is much more critical of Jewish society, more bitter and darker and more polemical and more intent on a kind of moral revolution. Lilienblum, on who I'm working, was very angry and very bitter, and saw the kind of the moral dissolution of the Jewish world, divided between, basically ruled by money, ruled by a kind of fundamental selfishness that operated on both sides, on the Jews who were quote unquote non-affiliated, who just wanted to make money, but also Jews who were now communities that were were observant, but had absolutely no investment in the future of Jewish life, who were raising children that were deeply parochial and equally immoral, and who saw the entire intellectual project, knowledge, ethics, culture, all these things that they had been fighting for, basically headed for death. I mean, the split in the Jewish world between the ignorant and non-observant and the kind of hidebound, Hasidic, non-readers, right, who were very also narrow-minded and also highly politicized. For the intellectuals, they increasingly felt like they had no place.
I'm sure listeners are listening to this and saying, wait. You said there were many that became not religious under the Freya, this new thing where people weren't religious, because when this started, back where people, there was no such thing. Okay, so at this point, late 19th century, 20th century, and they care more about, like you said, going and sending their kids to university, getting a secular education, and going to opera and reading literature. But they're going to, wasn't the Maskilim at fault? Didn't their program have an impact? What's your response to that?
My response to that is that, once again, I have to say that as Jewish people, we tend to overestimate the impact of intellectuals on the life of the laity. I'm sure your listeners can imagine that people making decisions, not on the basis of reading some book, but on the basis of what's good for them. And what people saw was that it was much better. I'll give you a funny story. So there's a very famous professor, right, of Oriental languages in St. Petersburg University, whose name is Daniel Chvolson. Daniel Chvolson converted to Christianity. And the story they tell about him is like this. They said to him, one of his Jewish relatives said to him, Professor Chvolson, tell us, did you convert for money, for upward mobility, or did you convert out of conviction? And Chvolson said, he was funny. I mean, he was a convert, he was a Jew. He said, I converted out of conviction. I was convinced that it was better to be a professor in St. Petersburg than a Melamed in Aichichok. So that tells you something, right? I mean, it's a joke, but it tells you that how most people conduct their lives is not by a book. As much as we would like to think that Jews make decisions on the basis of intellectual convictions, and I know that that's not true. Most Jews took advantage of the economic opportunities and the social mobility opportunities. And I got to tell you, what, Nachi, I don't really blame them. Because if you've got kids and you're thinking about how to feed them, and and you can send them to a Jewish school where their opportunities will be limited, or a university where they can get a degree and become a doctor, I can see lots of Jewish parents saying, you know what? He's got to go to med school. Not just for him, but maybe for us too. Because in 20 years, right, who's going to pay the rent? So this question, these are real problems. These are real issues. And, it's not like, there are people today who can't afford to spend money on sending their kid to yeshiva. They send them to public school because that's what's available. And, it's expensive to lead a frum life. I hear this all the time from my students. It's very expensive. And without and it was much more expensive in the 19th century. So when people saw these kinds of opportunities and all the cultural benefits that went with them, what do you think they did? They're human. It's lucky for us that some of us don't have to make those choices today, but the choices are real and we have to have respect for them. But I can tell you one thing. In 99 cases out of 100, whatever the Maskilim did had nothing to do with it. And it's very convenient to blame intellectuals for behavior to which we are all prone.
Lillian Bloom then and those like him were the vocal minority. It's true even until today. You think about, this is not a social critique podcast, but you think about people, I remember being in yeshiva, people are like, oh, you read, some non-Jewish book, you read some literature, apikarsis, you're going to go off the derech, right? Well, sadly, how many people that go off the derech or people that have, issues, it's not because they're reading secular literature. Why? It's because of all the vices that are going on and all the various things that are now available to people with smartphones and internet and drugs and whatever, what have you. It's not that they read some literature, suddenly they read a philosopher. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but that's not why. That's not what caused it. And that's what you're saying. It's not that they read, and they opened up Bibikuri Itim or Kerem Chemen and they said, oh, look at this article, Eitzer Nechman. Oh, look, Shadal wrote some critique to Shadal.
You put it like that, it sounds hilarious because I can't imagine, you've read most of the stuff. I can't imagine anyone reading Shadal or reading Lillian Bloom and saying, oh, I should go and stop observing Shabbat. I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah, it's not correct. They were it's just when you think about it that way. And again, not that there are people that read philosophy or different things that come out there, but yeah, the maskilim are definitely.
I think it's very comfortable for us to think that, ideas are kind of penetrate, there's someone to blame, right? I mean, and also we're still, the funny thing about this fight against the Haskalah or whatever it represents is that this is an argument that's been going on for 100 years. I mean, we are carrying on the same argument, right? That the Maskilim themselves had. And the thing is, it's not so good for Jews. Because ultimately, I mean, the idea, someone like Lillian Bloom, someone like Yalag, someone like, Shadal, someone like Mendelssohn, they wanted what we all want, right? They wanted people to behave themselves in a way that was charitable and honest and, what we associate with halakha, all of those ethical values, were the same values, so they're coming. I mean, I think ultimately, I would like to think, I'm not so sure that's true, but I would like to think that all of the debates about the Haskalah that are going on now are coming from a good place, right? Because we all really want the same things. We just don't know we want the same things. But Jewish intellectuals were never, ever on the side of Jews becoming selfish, immoral, lecherous, greedy people and alienated from their fellow Jews. Who wants that? That seems crazy to me.
I mean, the Maskilim, certainly weren't. If you read the Haskalah literature, and you'll see that, especially, go back to Wesley and read, it's all about morals, all about ethics. That's what he was busy with. And the Bali Musar liked him. So you go and you look at that. But it's just interesting, to think about the Maskilim. You say there is some interest, and I'm very curious to get the feedback. So listeners, please give feedback to this episode. Who the Geber or Jewish History Soundbites did recently a whole thing on Haskalah, and there's different Shalom Emes now. I'm curious to see the reaction. I had that one guy reaction to me, but a lot of it is read it first, read it, see what you think of the Maskilim, read their literature, and again understand it's not reform, it's not irreligious, not Freie Jews. That's not what they were writing. Many of them have, as you've argued in your book and read your book about romanticism, and they have this love of Judaism and Hebrew, and this is a time before Ivrit. That predates this. This predates things. It's a very interesting movement. Again, I'm not telling anybody to become a maskil or pro-maskil, or just to define what Haskalah was. Haskalah, when I tell people, when I say the word Haskalah or maskil, it's a dirty word. It's a terrible word to people. It's, and it's interesting where that comes from. I'm sure I'll get reactions to this, but where that comes from, why that is, So there's kind of definitely an interesting conversation going on about Haskalah. And now we should really talk about Haskalah's impact and Haskalah's legacy. But let's first talk about the impact, because it's interesting to think about, as I said, somebody sitting in Lakewood that had a yeshiva education, reading Wesley's Divrei Shalom Emes and saying, hold on, this created a firestorm. And again, that's not to say it shouldn't have. He's writing at a different time in a different place than we are today. You can't look back through your glasses, 2025 glasses. Well, no, of course we cannot do that. But someone sitting here, though, at the end of the day, sitting here reading this book and saying, wait, in Lakewood, in Brooklyn, in Muncie, in forget about, in those, but again, in the quote-unquote yeshivish communities, they're doing this. Like, what would, you take a maskil and you drop him into Lakewood today, you drop him into Brooklyn today, you drop him into yeshivish community, what would their reaction be? And also, what would the reaction of the other side, the anti-maskilim, be? That's the question.
I can tell you right now that one of the things they would think, I think, that Lakewood is a little too assimilated. That not enough people have a good command of Hebrew. That there is, that the intellectuals of this are not attentive enough to, Jewish books. They're reading too many newspapers, and then, to the publishing world that's putting out all this stuff in Hebrew, in English. They would not have liked that there's a kind of dumbing down of Jewish culture. They would not have liked that, right? That there isn't enough investment in communal investment in making more of our children more intellectual and more educated, and with knowledge of Hebrew, and with a deeper and more open mind. But the other thing they wouldn't have liked, I think, one of the things that worried them was that without an insufficiently critical knowledge of the world in which Jews live, they worried that Jews would not be in a position to know the difference between what is Jewish and what's not Jewish. And, this kind of living in a glass house or living in a gated community, I'll tell you a story about this. So at Cornell last year, we had a conference on biography, on the genre of biography in Jewish studies. And I work on this, and it's an issue that's very important to me. And one of the things we talked about at the conference was the idea that biography and biographical writing is really a Christian genre. And it comes from the Greco-Roman tradition and from the Christian tradition of the Gospels. And, the classical Jewish literature pushes against the biographical. And there's, if you think about Talmudic writing, it's a writing, in classical Jewish literature, the word Israel, refers both to the singular and to the plural, right? Afal pi shechata Yisrael is talking about an individual Jew. And that's because your Jewish ethic is that the one is connected to the many. The biographical genre is not it's a genre that's about that places the individual above the community. And we talked about this a lot at the conference, and I had a colleague at the conference who lives in Passaic. And she said to me at the end of this thing, we were talking, and she said, in my community, what sells a lot of books? The biographies of Rebbeim that Feldheim and that, Art Scroll puts out. And I said to her, and her husband teaches at YU, and she teaches at Princeton. And I said, I said, Eve, that's scandalous. I said, you have to say, this is not Jewish. And she said to me, she said, don't worry, it's just a fad. And, so that struck me. It's very interesting, right? If we are not aware of Jewish difference, if we just if we block ourselves off from knowing what it is that we're critiquing, we begin to use words like assimilation and like the word secular. And we begin to fetishize biographies, and we begin to do all kinds of things that feel, good to us, but that the reasons for which we don't really understand. And the Maskilim would not have been happy about this, that there's too much internal critique, right? We worry so much about what the other Jew does. Who's Fry, who's Orthodox, who's Passaic, who's this, who's that. Berkeley has nothing to say to, Lakewood, and Lakewood has nothing to say to the Upper West Side. We should be more worried about the non-Jewish world and what it's doing to all of us. And that's what the Maskilim would not have liked. We're spending our time arguing with each other or not talking to each other when we have bigger fish to fry. And if you sit around, insulting other Jews or not talking to other Jews, you're letting things happen that shouldn't be happening. And you're raising a generation of children that are, that think they have nothing in common with other Jews and that are, not worrying about the right things. And the one thing that the Maskilim worried about a lot is about, what the Jewish world looks like as a result of what the non-Jewish world does. And I feel like today they would not be pleased with that at all, that we're worrying about the wrong things and not worrying about the right things.
On the other hand, I think they would be pleased with a lot of what's happened to the educational curriculum, the educational system, even in places like Lakewood. Forget about the modern Orthodox world. They would say, well, the kids start off, they learn Aleph Beis, they learn all the Nikudas, they learn the vowelization, right? They learn basic diktuk, they have Yedias Klalias, they're learning math, they're learning English, even in a place like Lakewood where the high schools don't have, a regular English education, but they're having a basic English education. This is not something that was happening at the time. This is something they were fighting against.
This is my Maskilic project, okay? I'm going to tell you my Maskilic utopia. My Maskilic utopia is that, some machers get together and put money into a project that creates a non-denominational, non-sectarian Jewish school K through 12 everywhere in America, in every single metropolitan area, where every Jewish kid, I don't care if his parents are Lakewood or if his parents are modern Orthodox or if his parents are conservative Reform, can go for free. That's my Maskilic project. For free. And, and it should be acceptable. Whatever is taught, there's no hashkafa, but whatever is taught should be acceptable in the level of practice to every single Jewish parent that sends their kid there. That is my utopian project. So that, if someone out there is listening and wants to put money into this, I would love to see it happen. My favorite Talmudic story, I'm sure you know about this, about Yeshua ben Gamla, right? This is a guy with a very dicey reputation, for all kinds of reasons. And there's an argument about what we should do with him, right? Should we honor him? Should we not honor him? And I forgot who said this, but the verdict is we should honor him because he did, this is the guy who gets a lot of blame for, the destruction of the temple. He says, but, in the end, he also saved us. Because he was the high priest, right? Who was invested in what? In limud hatinokot, right? In elementary education, right? This to me, this is the best story. It's the only way, and this is what the Maskilim understood, and we somehow have forgotten about it. That this is in the end an educational project. That's what Vesely was about. That's what Mendelssohn was about. Every Maskil was about that, including Lillian Bloom. And the idea of, Yahadut as a kind of great Jewish school, I love that. I love that.
Although, I'll just say it won't happen. But
I know.
Yes. Okay. Just want to, burst the bubble.
It's utopian.
Yeah, it's utopia. Exactly. It will be in Star Trek. So, let's talk about the Haskalah's legacy. And obviously, we didn't mention much about the Wissenschaft, and there's so many, connected things. We mentioned some of the early figures. We threw out more, this. We didn't even get to Nachman Krochmal and Pearl and Shear and Shadal. And these are all figures that if we continue, we couldn't discuss more of this. Yitzchak Levinson, Lillian Bloom, and you mentioned Yalag. There's so many more, so much. And this is something that you place an emphasis on, and is the literature more than the philosophy. Really, a lot of the literature. There's so much literature, and there's all, I mentioned the journals. Like Nechmad, Bikurei Itim, Kerem Chemed, etc. Ham Asif. There's so many journals of the Haskalah that are out there. So, what's the Haskalah's legacy today?
I'm gonna put it in, because we have to wrap up. But the entire kind of, I was going to say it's art scroll, right? Of course, the Maskilim did not invent Jewish print, but if you think about the kind of explosion of Jewish literature, right, of various kinds, and I don't just mean fiction. As a kind of, as a place where, a lot of interesting things happen, right? The invention of a kind of new literature that stands somewhere between the existing, that broke the rabbinic monopoly on Jewish writing, and that transforms the experience of the Jewish reader. I think that, as a person who is more open to literary innovation, to a kind of education through literature. I think that this is, if you're going to put, the Jewish Review of Books, this podcast, the entire kind of intellectual apparatus. What they did, they carried the legacy of the Best Medrash and they expanded it. And they moved it into the 19th century. At the time that they were doing this, they didn't think that, this would have a future. But in point of fact, they created this literary industry that is no longer limited in its ambitions to certain kinds of genres. They, and they invented modern Hebrew. I mean, as a kind of, Naki, one of the biggest differences in modern Jews and everybody that came before us is that for the first time in Jewish history, we run the risk of a Jewish population that's completely monolingual, that speaks only English. That the Maskilim would have had a huge problem with. But the fact that that Hebrew continues to be a major force in our life and provides at least the basis for a common language between all of us, that's the Maskilic legacy. It's not reform, it's not ideology, it's not philosophy, but the fact that, you can go to Israel and you can talk to anybody in Israel in Hebrew and read a newspaper and go to the National Library and read a book. All of that, that's the Haskalah. Or no, that's Haskalah. No definite article, no capital. Haskalah, period.
Mic drop. Okay, so I will link in the show notes to your book, Haskalah, The Romantic Movement in Judaism. I'll link to Finder's book, is a lot of information, The Jewish Enlightenment. I'll link to Cortex, those interested in Mendelssohn's Jerusalem, Wesley's Divish of Emes. Now it's a new edition, Mossad Bialik. Mossad Bialik has also Moshe Leib Bloom's Chatas Neurim. I know that there'll be, there's some issues with that one, but that's the one that's the edition.
Your listeners should stay tuned because there'll be a new edition soon.
Okay, so we will definitely stay tuned. If you're teasing that here. I will try to find a link to Yeshua Inbal's book, Neorot Haskalah Mossad of Cook, for those interested in reading the full history. He goes through everything, and he has his take on Haskalah. He doesn't like the Maskilim. Full disclosure. Also, another interesting thing that just came out new as well is the B'nai Yissuscha. The B'nai Yisachar, he wrote a work, the Arachayim, this is a work of the Chassid Yavitz, so when the Spanish expulsion occurred, he blamed he blamed those that converted on learning philosophy. The B'nai Yisachar wrote a commentary, republishes with his own commentary called Me'ein Ganim, and it was his pushback against the Haskalah, and he wrote it on as a commentary or kind of riffing off of that book. So there's a beautiful, beautiful new edition with extensive notes and sort of introduction and notes and extra material in the back that just came out through MS Minkach's publication house. Really well worth reading. Anyone wants to read, the critique of Haskalah. There's also Pearl's Megalat Mirin and Beichen Tzedek in a new edition in Hebrew and in English. Both there's new editions of. So there's a lot to read for those interested. And so, obviously, Shadal, there's much out there. But I'm going to link to all of them. I'm just mentioning some of this here. I think those are the core books. Okay, any other books in English or any other reference materials to recommend to listeners?
I have to think. I mean, in English, wow, that's a tall order. I have to think about it. I mean, there's been new work on Mendelssohn, but he gets too much attention, in my opinion. Yeah. And you've got enough. I mean, more. I'm all pro. I'm definitely pro all the books for sure.
Yeah. Start there. Okay, yeah. And if like I said, and we welcome all feedback and critique and criticism. So anybody, please email me svarimchat@gmail.com, and I can reach out to Olga, or they can reach out to you as well. And so, and if anyone wants to hear more episodes, like I said, we couldn't dive much deeper into the Haskalah. It's not something we did. This was more of a cursory overview, even though we mentioned some, in the beginning about Mendelssohn and Wesley more in depth. But even there's much more to discuss. So, with that, thank you, Professor Litvak, for joining me.
My pleasure.